got one of those great opportunities now to introduce myself, giving a speech a year ago. It's now April of 2014, and this speech that you're about to see, this talk, was given in Memorial Day weekend of 2013. So let me first say, my name is Jonathan Gradess. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Defenders Association. As Frank said earlier, I've been the Executive Director since 1978. And the Defenders Association is a backup center for all of the state's public defense lawyers. There are some 6,000 of them, and what we spend most of our time trying to do is to improve the quality of public defense representation, which needs, frankly, a great deal of improvement. But for a number of years, we have been looking at the issue of the representation of veterans. In the talk that you're about to hear, you'll hear that we were describing why it's necessary. My talk is entitled Representing the Accused Veteran. And you'll hear about our plans then to establish and create a Veterans Defense Program. I'm happy to report that all of those reasons for creating a Veterans Defense Program have culminated in the establishment, beginning this very month, of a Veterans Defense Program which is opened in our offices in Albany, and a new office which we have just opened in Batavia. Our intention is to work with public defense lawyers and private lawyers throughout the state in any case where a veteran has been charged with a criminal offense. We want to create the protocols that lawyers need so that they can be conscious of how to represent veterans. We want to train them in the kind of paperwork and information that they need to represent those veterans, and how to talk about military culture with veterans in a way not to scare them off from representation. We have a new director whose name is Gary Horton, who's been working with veterans and the Genesee Veterans Network for many years after having started it. And his associate and administrative assistant, Dee Miller, have opened the office in Batavia. We're going to bring on some more staff, and it is our hope to build this program so that it is robust and statewide. And what you'll hear me talking about on this segment is the reason for that. So I got the good news when I came up here. I don't have to cut it down to keep us on track. I get my time, which is good, and I'll tell you why. It was this morning at about 5 o'clock, I got up and I took a page from Larry Betts. Who knows who Larry Betts is? Larry Betts was one of the vets that we saw up at Mount McGregor in the film yesterday, and he said that he had been doing a thing called backtracking, which is a term I actually had never heard before. Maybe Leslie has, I don't know. So I backtracked, and I backtracked largely because of Brian's play. I backtracked all the way to 1964, particularly because I don't think it's an accident that we're all here together. And I wanted to think about how that non-accident has come about, and I wanted to think about why it was that I felt as if I was part of a band of brothers last night, because I didn't want to feel like I was sailing under false colors, but I am a civilian. I've never been, I'm not a veteran. I did not go to war. In fact, my entire experience was to not go to war. And I thought I should start by telling you about it, because last night it became clear, and over this weekend it became clear, that the generation that lived through Vietnam lived through it together. People who stayed home, people who went, all were profoundly and traumatically affected by it. So let me share with you just at the outset, in the interest of telling the same kind of stories that you've been telling, a little bit about my journey that brings me actually here this weekend, because there's a direct path. I didn't know how direct it was until I started to backtrack. In 1964, at the time, and I want to tell you, I did it with the thought of like the kinds of things that were happening to me yesterday that were jolting me into consciousness. In 1964, in the summer, in August, at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, I was teaching horseback riding at a summer camp to children. So when Bob Nevins stood up and talked about what he talked about, I had a special interest and a special connection. And at that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, because I was 17, I, like a lot of people, said, okay, let's go. Hey, they're bombing us, let's go. And so when my son was 17, in 2003, when Bush was saying, let's go, I wrote a piece in the Albany Times-Union protesting the war and indicating how I wanted my son to know that they were lying to him. And I, of course, said that before it was revealed that they were lying to him, but I had been lied at, as you were, in the Gulf of Tonkin. Then Pete spoke last night, and he said that well, I don't think he actually said this, but he said it this morning. I thought he had said it, that he had sort of gotten involved in '67, and what he may have said is he was in Army intelligence learning Vietnamese. Well, in 1967, I was so frustrated at the Vietnam War and the pain that was being caused in Indochina that I left college. I went to New York. I said, I told my family I'm going to go to Vietnam. Why are you going? I don't know. What are you going to do? I want to help people. This is crazy. When I didn't go, I ended up not going precisely because I did not speak Vietnamese. The year that Pete learned it, I didn't know it, and therefore I didn't go. And I went back to college, and for the remainder of my college years, I protested the war in Vietnam. In 1968, when some of you were deploying, I met Donald Duncan, who was the Green Beret who in those days was coming out against the war. Drank scotch with him, had him come to talk about it, the war, to people who were still making up their minds. And I think I learned as early as then, if not sooner, that you can be against the war, but not the warriors. So much over the last couple of days has been good for me. I also had a college professor in 1968 named John Stipp. Years later, about 7 years later, I went to see him and he told me I'm writing a book. It's called The Four Revolutions of the 60s. It was a book that took the historical perspective that the real impact of the 1960s would not be felt for 40 years. And he described those four revolutions as these: black-white, male-female, sexual, and war-peace. Now, it is fair to say that, based on his thesis and my love for him, I lived from that day to this in the belief that the real impact of the 60s would be felt, or begin to be felt, in 40 years. So in 2003, when we went to New York City to protest the Iraq War, the Bush War, and it was wall-to-wall people, for those of you who were there, from one side of Manhattan, one river to the other, a lot like Woodstock, where I also was, by the way. It was the beginnings of what I thought was the Stipp thesis, because it was happening in cities all over the world. There were people just like us saying no. So that same year, 68, turned into 1969 fairly easily. And that's why last night was so, in many ways, so profound for me, because when the roots of Memorial Day, the play, which you guys missed, and I'm sorry about it, when those roots were being planted in 1969, I was deciding that the roots of my resistance to war were being planted, and I was deciding that I would go to prison instead of go to war. And my reason for wanting to go to prison was that I was sure that I qualified as a conscientious objector. But I had been influenced by a lot of people who were Quakers and who were activists who felt that taking that status because you had a special ability to do it was discriminatory against people who, just like you, might not have opposed the war but might not have had a religious basis for it. So I pretty much convinced myself I would resist the draft, go to prison. I wanted to raise a jury nullification defense. I'm sorry John Amadon left. He would have liked to have been around in those days. I tracked Bill Kunstler up to the Rick Boardman draft trial in Boston. Rick Boardman was a Quaker lineage back to Plymouth Rock. No question he would have been a CO, no question. But he burned his draft card. He turned in his draft card because he felt, I think I was very influenced by him, and he felt that was discriminatory. Interestingly enough, upstairs that same day was the selective service system was ruled unconstitutional in Boston in April of 1969. Kept watching people running out of the courtroom. They were all running upstairs to hear what had been done by Judge Sessions, I think was his name. But I also didn't realize then, but I do realize now, that much of what I was entrenched in those days and much of what passed for the protest against the Vietnam War was really self-interested by the draft. It was the draft that drove a lot of that. I don't know how much the draft drove it for me, frankly, even now. I've still worked through that after this weekend, probably. I don't think it was, but it surely had to play a part. But that decision to go to prison soon changed itself. When I got out of college, I grew afraid to go to prison. And with damn good reason, for those of you who've been there, I think. And then I sort of said, okay, well, I'll become a CO. I'm going to certainly get a CO. I wrote a 125-page CO form. I mean, I'm a CO. My mother was raised in a peace church, the Disciples of Christ. The Methodist church, which I was baptized in, has a very strong plank on conscientious objection. I had never doubted I could qualify for one. Of course, I got reclassified as 1A, but I never doubted I should be, and I became one that way. And gratifying to me and supportive of that being against the war, not the warriors. A lot of the people who wrote for me were men who were in the military, who had been in ROTC when I was in college. They had appeared in ads in the paper saying, these men are in ROTC, why don't you ask them why? So we'd create an ad that said, these men are not in ROTC, why don't you ask them why? And while there was a lot of hostility in the peace movement, there was, I don't recall any in me. And I always tried to reach out to the ROTC guys. I always wanted to keep them from going. And we became friends and in dialogue, and it was respectful. And their letters were very meaningful, but 1969 was meaningful for another day, which, when you listen to Larry Betts and you backtrack, you can put into context. My college roommate was blown off a half-track in 1969. He was forced, due to terrible circumstances and unfair academic circumstances, to leave school, was subject immediately to the draft, went to Vietnam, not there long, lost his left hand and was blown off a half-track, came home, but many burns and in terrible shape. Fast forward to 1994, George Pataki runs for governor of New York State. He reserves one bill for himself, bill number 1, the death penalty. This is a man who's running for governor of the state. Think of it. You could reserve bill number 1 to feed the hungry. You could build your reputation on stopping AIDS. You could reserve the first bill for housing the homeless. And George Pataki reserves it for the death penalty. And in 1995, when Dave McCulloch drank himself to death from PTSD from Vietnam, died in a bottle in Saugatuck, Michigan, I was too busy fighting the death penalty to go to his memorial. And I've been about that busy ever since, because the kind of injustice that I am swimming in does not stop, as you know, as we've talked about this weekend. Anyway, thinking I was going to get a CO, I went to the New York City Legal Aid Society in the fall of 1969 and said, I'm going to need alternative service. And I was hired as the second paralegal in the history of that organization. And way has gone on to way. My major contribution, because I want to talk a little bit about the defects in the state public defense system so that you can have a context for your frustration when you think about the need for veterans to receive an adequate defense. It's very difficult for anyone in New York to receive an adequate defense, and it is particularly difficult, for reasons I hope to address, for veterans too. My contribution to the Legal Aid Society of New York City in 1969, I spent a year as a paralegal, was to change them to the idea of having file folders for their cases. When I started there, lawyers used to walk into court with a stack of papers which they would place on the desk about this far from a prosecutor, and on the top of that stack would always have a little note that said, defendant denies or defendant admits. I don't know about those prosecutors, but I would have been really interested in the top sheet, and it was very close. And I observed this as a paralegal, and I went to the administration. I said, I really think things would be improved if you could put those in file folders. Maybe the name of the client could go on it. And I accomplished it. Now I am working a lot more in upstate New York, and these are the kinds of problems 44 years later that are present here. But I observed something else, and that has propelled me quite on a track to this, and I want to tell you what that was. Every day we saw Vietnam vets returning who were caught up in the criminal justice system. They were drinking, they were drugging, they were committing crimes, they were experiencing combat-related stress disorders. We didn't call it PTSD then. And they were, quite frankly, as near as I can tell, at least I've projected this in my memoir mind, I think they were being ignored on that call for help. Well, one of two things was happening. They were either being ignored, and I mean by ignored not something, well, there were three kinds of ignored. There was this kind of cognitive dissonance that emerged from, here's a young lawyer who's gone through 4 years of a college deferment, 3 years of a draft deferment, has his hair down to his shoulders, and is anti-war, representing a vet, probably was an unsavory experience, didn't work that well. That's one. The other was that 365-person calendar, it's a little hard to get to know your client whether they're vets or not. And the third is we didn't know what we were looking for, and it was easy for people who cared they had a vet to argue, Your Honor, he's just back from the service. So a lot of vets who could have used service, concern, kinds of things that Ed has been talking about and you're all talking about, were shunted out very quickly because even though they may have needed services, they didn't get them. They got kind of a veteran's break. So however you looked at it, that whole thing didn't work that well. And that is the reason that if you look at the veterans cadres in the state prison system, the largest cadre of prisoners right now in New York State are Vietnam vets. So somewhere in the 80s, 1980, by 1980, I had, actually in 1978, I was made the first executive director of the New York State Defenders Association. I've been there 35 years. I'm the only executive director. But in 1980, we backed up the lawyer, the Broome County Public Defender, who raised, to my knowledge, the first PTSD defense. I don't know if it's in the country, but certainly the first one in New York. That client is serving 62 to life. The defense was not very well developed. What we needed to know was not very well known. I don't know how much help we were, but it all didn't work. Steve Wax is now federal public defender in Oregon. You may have read about him a couple of years ago when the FBI made that false claim of fingerprints and picked up some poor guy in Oregon, quickly arrested him, and then the Spanish police found out that it wasn't his fingerprint. Steve Wax is the person who defended that case. So he's always been an innovative lawyer, but he didn't raise the defense too well. So by the time the 80s kept moving, it struck, there was a guy by the name of Van Swyzen who was running the New York State Criminal Justice Coalition, just retired as a public defender in Saratoga County. He and I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a reconciliation, the first national conference of reconciliation between Vietnam veterans and war resistors. And so we had a meeting with VVAW and the War Resistors League. I saw you shake your head at him. It's a great idea. Yes, please talk about it. I will talk about it. It didn't happen, but it could have happened. It should have happened. And I guess this weekend proves to me maybe it ought to happen. But we also had a thought of, wouldn't it be great to create a 440 project, a project that could go in post-conviction and reopen these Vietnam vet cases and go show that they were not done well. And despite our effort to try and do that, we were unable to finance that. And for us, we work a very long, hard week just doing the job we have. So a lot of these bright ideas require financing, and the state isn't actually attuned to the needs of the public defense system, shall we say. So that didn't happen either. But in that, the roots of, and I did want to say one other thing about the STIP thesis, because John Amadon left earlier today, but you may remember that he said yesterday, this generation of vets will save us. I think the context for that, really, if you look at the people doing generational research in America, is that the millennials will save us. And this generation of vets are millennials. The theory is that the people who, and it's the STIP thesis, if that's all you're thinking about, you can always fit it into a box. But I think it is the STIP thesis. The millennials, that generation of people who were born beginning in 1980, some of your children and certainly all of mine, have characteristics very much like their grandparents, the civics. But they have all that it takes, you 20-year-olds, to fix it. And so I think John was, in a way, very right. So was STIP, and so can we be. So anyway, all of this stuff created the roots for an idea some years ago, an idea that was coming to fruition when we wanted to be ahead of the curve. As we saw all these deployments from Fort Drum, and we saw one brigade always in Afghanistan, one brigade always in Iraq, one brigade always at home, and the Jefferson County Public Defender, as I mentioned yesterday, always underwater. I have filed an affidavit as an expert witness or a fact witness, I don't quite know which it's going to be yet, in a systemic lawsuit against the state of New York for having a defective public defense system. And when I got to the portion of my affidavit affirmation on caseload, I used Jefferson County as an example, which is why I happen to remember that there was at least one lawyer there at the time I did that affidavit that handled 2,265 cases a year. If you do the math, which I'm not particularly skilled at, but I did it when I wrote the affidavit, I think it's about 59 minutes, if you're lucky, per client that you would have. And I want to segue at this point almost into the public defense system by saying, think for a minute if you would, and some of you who have been clients assuredly will think, what that means if equal protection law means anything, it means that what that lawyer has to do in that 59 minutes, they have to have an interview with the client, have to develop rapport with that client, have to spend the time with the client's family to make things understandable to them once they've come back and gotten permission of the client. They have to file motions on behalf of that client and investigate the facts of that case. I'm looking at Bill Bastick now. He spent $150,000 to have that done, but public defenders don't have that kind of capacity, so some of them don't have investigators, but they have to investigate the facts and they have to investigate the law because that's what the Court of Appeals has said is required in every criminal case. They have to then talk to the prosecutor and think about whether or not there's going to be an alternative disposition or whether they're going to plead guilty or whether they're going to come up with a theory of defense for trial. And if they are going to come up with a theory of defense for trial, what else do they need and what experts do they need and what is the evidence that they have discovered and what has their investigator told them? They have to put all that together into a theory of defense and to work it through, and then they have to sit with some other lawyers and brainstorm. That's what the practice of the defense law is. When that doesn't happen, it's not being done right, and I don't care anybody anywhere who says it differently. And frankly, most people will say it differently because the capacity to do that isn't there. And unless people, lawyers, public defenders, traumatized by this circumstance, unless they want their heads to explode, they will compromise with every one of the principles I just described to you. From the interviewing, from the family visits, from the rapport, from the motions, from the... So we started to think, holy shit, what a perfect storm this will be in a system where there's no capacity to do the regular case. How in the world, with this onslaught of returning vets, will they do those kinds of cases? And what will be the impact if they aren't done right? The impact, if they aren't done right, is that we will repeat what we did in the 60s and 70s with the men and women who came back from Vietnam. Many more men then, but So, in a very real way, I guess it is fair. I want to turn to the public defense system, and then I want to talk about defending accused veterans. But I think it is fair for me to say after this weekend that over the years, my practice has become quite trauma-informed. I was fortunate enough to be the first chairperson of the Restorative Justice Commission of the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese, and I'm looking at Leslie now. One of the things that the New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty did after we abolished George's death penalty, Bill number 1 lasted 9 years, but no one was executed, and everyone is off death row. Sorry about that, Pataki. You should have worked on the homeless. The New Yorkers for Alternatives to Death Penalty had to figure out what it was going to do. And one of the things that it did was to get into real anti-violence work and to work with victims. And one of the things we did was lobby for SNUG, which is guns spelled backward, which is a $4 million statewide effort to replicate ceasefire. And you may want to know why I've gone down this path. I went down this path because one of the people who helped Leslie develop one of her card games worked in Harlem on their SNUG program, and later I'm hoping she'll get a chance to talk about that just briefly because the card game on reentry was worked out by a SNUG person in Harlem. Anyway, the one other experience that brought me to where I am is that 13 years ago I started representing with Gary Horton, who, by the way, runs a veterans program as the Genesee Public Defender. He's the chairman of the board of the Genesee Veterans Support Network. Wanted to be here today, but he's on I don't know if he's on a vet's ride. If he is, he's probably very wet, but that's why he couldn't come, and I think he'll regret it. But he and I represent the forgotten victims of Attica. They are the families of the guards who were assassinated by the state police in Attica in 1971. I use that word assassinated because I like it, because that's what happened. And we have won $12 million for the families, and the right to appear forever on the grounds of Attica is now in statute, and they derived counseling, and now we're going after the Attica records to open them up, and at some point, this is on tape, right? At some point, we'll be back to ask the governor for an apology. Not time yet. But he's actually gotten involved in helping us get the record, so I assume that apology would be something he'd be honored to give at some point. So many public officials throughout the world have done so many apologies in reconciliative efforts that this one is needed. But in any event, all of this sort of came flooding into me yesterday when I'm listening. I've wanted to meet Ed Tick for years. I've known he's there. We want him to come by the commission and talk, but I'm busy. But we're going to make it happen before this day is over. But and I've worked with Peter Young, who was mentioned at McGregor yesterday, and so much of what was discussed when we talked about a new system with Bill and other people that is so wrong with the trail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em philosophy that we have in this country. What ought to happen with vets is they ought to be having restorative justice, and the process ought to include the kind of healing measures that are here, but we're not there yet. So let me change gears, but I wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to share one other thing, which I'd also like a little help with. I mentioned at breakfast. I've been training young public defenders for years and years and years in a basic trial skills program where we try to get them to be more sensitive to their clients, try not to develop barriers between them and their clients because their work is very traumatic, because their work is so difficult and their caseloads are so high. They come into this work with a desire to help human beings. They come in because they believe that somebody ought to stand up. Sometimes they even know that they will be absorbing the violence of this culture for their clients, but they want to do what is right for poor people. They come into public defense work when they could do something else. They're client-centered in their minds when they start, with very few exceptions. But very quickly, because they are under pressure, because their caseloads are high, because prosecutors deprive them of information, because judges want to move calendars, because the press is ignorant and fails to report the real story about justice anywhere, anytime. Because of all that, they find themselves, and because if you want to talk to a client's family, you have to first talk to the client, and they haven't talked to the client yet because 35 clients are ahead of that. But the client is calling from the jail, but they don't want to return the phone call because they don't want to sound like an idiot, but they don't even know what that case is about, so they don't answer the one call of the one person that they came into the work to do. Talk about trauma. And that converts itself, because people are human, into kind of negative attitudes about clients, right? They're always calling. They want so much. And it's a sick cycle that needs to be broken. So for the first time and I'm embarrassed to say this after this weekend, but since 1987, we've never addressed in this trainer secondary trauma, but we're going to this week, and I actually want to talk to you about some help with that. Anyway, so that was my introduction. Now let me talk about what I was asked to come here to talk about, but I felt I owed you that because this has been a great gift for me. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some stuff that you all already know. I mean, one of the things I realized in sitting here is like all of my notes I had to throw out because everybody knows much of what I was going to say, but I want to say it in I want to talk about it maybe in a slightly different way. If you think about, I was making a list about 3 days ago of, okay, so I have to be able to talk English in this room. And so what does the defense of a veteran mean? And I agree with what Paul said yesterday. And our favorite judge in New York, Judge Russell, who created the first Veterans Court in America, is here. And anything I say bad about Veterans Courts, it doesn't include his court. But the Veterans Courts that have been created in the country, like so many of the specialty courts, are courts that are designed for cases that are not controversial because someone drove through the wilderness with a shotgun and knifed someone because they thought they were on a combat mission. Those are not in Veterans Court. But think about this for a minute and think about what I want these defense lawyers to be able to do. And then I'm going to fast forward quickly through the public defense system and then come back to that. But I'm still doing pretty good, I think. You get trained to become proficient in the use of equipment to commit intentional homicide on people. You learn to put people to death by intentional means in hand-to-hand combat. You're trained in the scheduled conduct of homicide. You plan and practice together, which in the free world is called conspiring. You plan and practice together to perform with others acts which would be criminal under the domestic American state laws. And in a sense, what is most inculcated by the values of the military, and you know, I don't have to tell you what that list is, but the value of aiding, abetting, or assisting others to perform those acts. So you have spent, if you have been well trained by the military, and we know that they can do one thing, which is to train you well. You've been trained to aid and abet others, to conspire with them, to commit intentional homicide downrange. You are brought from there, tarmac to tarmac, sometimes in 24 hours, with all that occurred bundled inside of you in so many ways. I love that Bob Nevins guy. Great. But if something happens, and it can be anything, it can be as simple as a DWI up in the North Country, where because you're used to driving down the middle of the road to avoid IEDs, that you hug the middle of the road, you got a case of beer because they would only sell you a damn case, you couldn't get a six-pack, you got a shotgun because you want to carry it, and you're arrested by an officer who hasn't got a clue, and they're getting more of a clue, but you're much more dangerous because of what you've done and what we've trained, and you all know that. Problem is that I think it's not an easy thing for everyone else to know. It's certainly, from what I hear here in the last 2 days, well, I never believe DAs I'm not even sure they're retrainable, to tell you the truth. But if they are, they sure haven't yet learned this. And they have the same kind of trauma that public defense lawyers say, I hope this is on tape, Jeepers. Nobody will believe I even said this. Cy Vance, this is for you. They know damn well this system is broken, most of them, if they're intelligent. They know it is not working. They came, and maybe they came to do something to stop crime, but they know they're recycling human beings. They know that they don't have any real power over them. They know that if they intervene with the cops who might be lying to them, they will lose the cops as allies, and then they can't do their job. And their job mostly is to go up the chain of command, become a judge, and retire. Because most of our county court judges are former DAs. I'm sorry. I said this at a speech where I was with Bill Bastick, and somebody said, I didn't know that. Check it out. So, in reality, but they're in trauma too, because you can't sleep with that every night. You can't be sending people to these long prison terms. You can't, you have to be a human to be able to do that without a price. But there needs to be a way to translate that military experience in a courtroom. And there are two kinds of things, I think, that are going on in my mind. Two things that we would like, if we get a unit together, that we would do. And in the meantime, we'll practice ways to do it without a unit. But when you ask what defenders have to do out there, it's to understand how combat and service-related injuries affect two different things. It's how they affect personal culpability, but it's related to the fair adjudication of that responsibility, and it's related to the mitigation of punishment. Now, we have fairly well addressed, theoretically, people understand that it ought to mitigate punishment, but they haven't really gotten over the hump, which is what we wanted to be able to address, is that it really also goes directly to the question of whether or not they were really responsible. Because the theory of our criminal law is that you create an act and you intend the consequences of that act, and you create the mental state in which you formulate the intent to do this act. That isn't what's happening. If you read that, there was a woman named Sontag who called me a few years ago. The wonderful thing about this is you aspire to create a unit and everybody thinks you've got one. The New York Times consulted when they did that article it's got to be 5 years ago. I think it may have been called War Torn or something else, but they covered 118 veterans who have been in the United States prosecuted for and convicted of murder. First-time offenders. No prior criminal record at all. All having experienced United States military combat training, all having served in a combat zone, all having returned without the kinds of decompression that we've been talking about for 2 days. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this has to invade the space which we reserve for the fair adjudication of responsibility, because in some new, perhaps new, non-traditional sense, vets are not responsible. Now, I've heard people say, in fact, one of our, the brother who was talking yesterday, who doesn't appear to be here today, said, I don't believe in giving up, that you should allow people to get away with it. Well, I actually do believe that you should allow people to get away with it. And I don't mean get away with it in the sense of not being accountable for the harm, or even accountable to the person harmed, but in the sense of America, where we create presumptive incarceration for people found guilty of crimes, I believe they should get away with it. And I'll tell you something else. I got a great dream in the back of my head that if we can accomplish for people traumatized by war injuries, and I do have reservations sometimes about this tape. Oh, well, the plot is this. I hope that we'll be able to set a standard for having the culture and the court system appreciate the trauma of other people. Because the actual truth of our world, the truth for veterans, the truth for everyone is that hurt people hurt people. It's what happens. It's the way the world turns. So now I want to tell you why this dream of doing a great thing is so complicated. What the hell time do I have? I have till 10 o'clock? This was moved rather quickly, even with my extra 15 minutes. All right, quickly. The New York State Public Defense System, what is it? It is a gigantic mess. I alluded to it yesterday, but I promised to talk about it today. And it's the problem that I have in doing this. Because if you want to think, oh yeah, well I'll retrieve the records, I'll get I'll check out the downrange circumstances, I'll put together a defense, I'll get a social worker, we'll make this case, we'll go to trial. That's not going to happen. Most of these cases will be pleas of guilty. Why will that be? Because the work that has to be done can't be done. It's not that people wouldn't intend and like to do it. They'd probably love to do it. We're going to train on this summer. But we have a system that is like this. If you were to get on the Major Deegan, which for those of you out of the state is a highway that starts, it's the beginning of the New York State Thruway. It's in the northern border of the Bronx, runs all the way to Chautauqua County, although most people never go beyond Buffalo, I think. You pass through 19 counties. There are 62 counties in New York State, and in those 62 counties there are 120 different plans for providing public defense services. I mean by public defense services, those services that are required for people who can't afford a lawyer in a criminal case. Those plans, if any two of them are like each other, it's by accident. If you go through those 19 counties, and God forbid you are arrested in every one of them, the experience in each one would be different than the experience in the other. You could pick you could be arrested by luck of the draw in a county that would be present with a good lawyer at your arraignment. You could also languish in court in jail for 3 weeks before a lawyer is appointed for you. You could draw a public defender that has a full-time investigator, or you could draw a public defender that has no investigative services at all. You could draw, well, it used to be, I'm up around Orleans, but used to be you could draw a drunk right around here, but he's gone. That means that the investigation of cases is not routine. It means that lawyers meet their clients in courtrooms. It means that the work that they do is done in the courtroom for about 5 minutes beforehand. I have a client advisory board. We've held hearings all over the state in the client community. Schoharie, farm worker hearings in Western New York, videotaping on the streets of Brooklyn. All over, it's the same story. I saw my lawyer for a few brief minutes before, and frankly, this was my practice before I quit the Legal Aid Society in New York City. I wasn't there very long. I'd started as a paralegal in '69, as I told you. I did one thing. I went to law school for 3 years. I applied for one job. I wanted to come back and be a lawyer. I was a lawyer in the South Bronx, and it was obscene. I quit not long after I was there. Representing 300 people a day, I wasn't going to do it. And so the reality is that the time to do the work isn't present. The caseloads are high, and as a consequence, this is going to be a major lift. Now let me tell you a couple of things I'm doing to accomplish it. We're trying to seek money for this Military and Veterans Defense Unit. We'll keep trying. We're going to train lawyers in the meantime. I've drafted a bill, which I have a couple of copies of here. I was hoping it was going to be introduced before this week. I hope it will be introduced next week. But it's a bill that would create a diversionary mechanism for every veteran who's brought before a criminal court. They would have to establish that they were veterans. They would have to establish they had been in a combat zone or were in the military but injured there, and that injury was in part related to the crime that they were charged with. And it is a bill that has been going to be introduced by Assemblyman Brindisi and Senator Griffo. I fear it may be amended a little from the scope that we've written it in, which covers every case in the state, but it's a start. And there is one other thing that I want to share with you. Thank you. And that is this. And Mac asked me to talk about this, and I talked about it a little this morning, so I'm going to share it with you. It's what we call an inchoate idea, I think, but it isn't all that inchoate. I have a not-for-profit corporation, which is a 501c3, but we also have a 501c4. And that 501c4 corporate entity ran the campaign for an independent public defense commission, which those of you who are in New York hopefully knew about. It was an effort to get a state defender system. It resulted in a state office of indigent legal services, not exactly what we had in mind, but a compromise that has a good staff and hopefully will keep us moving. But we've been reserving the name of the Justice Fund for a future entity, and I want to just share with you that entity, and anybody who's interested in it should see me. It's a little known fact, but one that I dearly love, that an organization consisting of veterans can accept tax-deductible donations deductible for the donor and can lobby 100% of the time with that money. Let me say that again. If you're a veterans organization, which requires about 75 people to join and a board primarily made up of veterans, you can create a veterans organization that can be tax deductible to the donor and lobby 100% of the time with the money. So when I found out about this, and this probably should have been in my backtracking, I went to law school with a guy by the name of Bobby Mueller. Bobby Mueller started Vietnam Veterans of America, but he also started the foundation associated with VVAW. And about 10 or 15 years ago, the people in the abolition of the death penalty movement went to Bobby and said, we could use some help. We were trying to pass a bill through Congress called the Innocence Protection Act, which had this rare, odd idea that if you're innocent, you probably shouldn't be executed by a state. And they were creating remedies to protect. And Bobby threw his lot in with us and created a thing called the Justice Project. And for many years, I knew it was doing this great work and was all criminal justice work. And I said, what are all these veterans doing running around here? I mean, it's great. Bobby's cool. We got him involved. But why is this a veterans organization? Here's why. Because a veterans organization, even one working exclusively on reforming the criminal justice system in the New York State legislature, can lobby 100% of the time and still receive tax-deductible contributions. So my Justice Fund, the Defenders Justice Fund board, has on its agenda the discussion of doing this with our reserved name. And my friend Ed Geider brought his friend Larry Signer here, who I'm sorry you guys missed the play, but I'm going to talk Larry Signer in before the end of this day to help me organize to get those 75 members. But nothing would make my heart warmer than to start with interested people from right here who are interested in lobbying to change the criminal justice system in New York, because that's what we're going to do. Okay, thanks.